which isn't secret but might as well be. And please put on the recording the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this is a presentation of my personal views. Now, I was supposed to give a speech yesterday. I found out yesterday morning that it had been canceled, and that the people who were going to go to that had been asked to come here. Is there anyone here who was going to go to yesterday's talk? I guess not. I guess not. That doesn't actually surprise me too much. Oh well. It had a somewhat broader topic, and so I was going to struggle to squeeze in the things I was going to talk about, but I don't have to. So, what is free software? Free software is software that respects your freedom and your community. So it's free as in freedom. We're not talking about price. We don't mean gratis software. We mean freedom respecting software. So to understand free software, think of free speech, not free beer. So in Polish, you're better off because the word wolny doesn't mean gratis. Unfortunately, it means slow, but you have to live with that. You still have to say wolny. Anyway, people will find out for themselves that our software is not slow. So when a program is not free, we call it proprietary, non-free, user-subjugating software. A non-free program generates a system of unjust power. Power for the program's owner over its users. It's a system of digital colonization, and like any colonial system, it keeps people divided and helpless. They're divided because they're forbidden to redistribute the program to each other, and they're helpless because they don't have the source code, so they can't change it. They can't even verify independently what it really does to them. And frequently it's designed to do nasty things. I'll give you more details of that in a few minutes. So, software should be free. Non-free software is an injustice. It shouldn't exist. But what I've said is very general. It respects freedom and community. What does that mean? I'd better be more specific. A program is free software if it gives you the 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so it does your computing as you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help others. That's the freedom to make exact copies and distribute them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to make and distribute copies of your modified versions to others when you wish. So if the program comes adequately with these 4 freedoms, then it's free software because the social system of its distribution and use is an ethical one that respects users' freedom and community. But if one of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, then it's proprietary software. Because it imposes an unethical social system on its users. Thus, the distinction, by the way, to be adequate, these 4 freedoms have to apply to all activities in life. But none of them is required. You're free to do these things, but you're not required to do these things. For instance, with Freedom 0, you're free to run the program as you wish, but this is not required. If you're a masochist, you can run it as you don't wish. And you also have the option of not running it. With Freedom 1, you're free to study the source code and change it, but it's not required. You can get the program and run it and not look at anything. With Freedom 2, you're free to make a copy and distribute it to someone else, but it's never required. We don't say, you make a copy for him. No, you're free to do it if you wish. The point is, nobody else should stop you. No one else should forbid you to make a copy, to give or sell to him. And with Freedom 3, if you have made a modified version, you're free to distribute copies of that. But it's not required. You can go on using your modified version privately, in which case we call it private software. A private program may be free, but only one user has it. Now, if it's free software, that user is free to distribute copies to others, but may choose never to do so, in which case it remains a private program in the hands of one user. And all one users have the four freedoms, so it's free software. In a sort of trivial way. I am feeling very thirsty. These seem to have been drunk. Oh, this one hasn't been. But I better check that it doesn't come from Coca-Cola Company. Well, that's how it's pronounced in Polish, right? Coca-Cola. There's a worldwide boycott of Coca-Cola Company for murdering union organizers in Colombia and Guatemala. For more information, look at killercoke.org. So the first bottle of water I drank out of in Poland, we looked in the usual way for something saying Coca-Cola Company, and we didn't see it. Turns out it was written very small. I've never seen that before. Usually they write it in very big letters. It's easy to see and easy to avoid. But this does not seem to be from Coca-Cola Company. What? Oh. Well, my memory for the taste of water is not that good. Anyway, do take a look at killercoke.org. You'll be shocked. So, where was I? Oh, right. So, the distinction between free and proprietary software is not a technical distinction. It's not a question of what features the program has. It's not a question of how it implements those features. It's not a question of how the code was written. Those are all technical details. This is an ethical, social, and political distinction, which is why it's so important. The use of a free program in society is development. Every program embodies knowledge. If it's free software, that knowledge is available to the users to understand. And then they can maintain, adapt, and extend the program. They can also use their knowledge in other ways. But the use of a proprietary program in society is not development at all, because it's dependence. Imposed dependence on one particular entity. And that is wrong. That's a social problem. If we see people using a non-free program, we should try to put an end to that use. To develop and publish a free program is a contribution to society. How much? That depends what the program does. If it does a lot of useful things very well, it's a big contribution. If it does very little and does it badly, it's a small contribution. But if the program is free software, that means it's released in such a way that it can contribute whatever it has to offer. But to develop and release a proprietary program is no contribution because it's a power grab. It's an attempt to subjugate other people. In social terms, that proprietary program is a trap. If it has attractive features, those are the bait. So paradoxically, if a proprietary program is convenient to use, that doesn't mean it's better. That means it does more harm. The best proprietary program is one nobody uses. Because they're all negative numbers, and this is a negative number that's pretty close to zero. So if you have the choice to develop a proprietary program or do nothing at all, you should do nothing at all, because that way you are not doing harm to society. To develop a proprietary program is doing harm. Now, in real life, you probably have other options that might be better than both of those. But if it's just a choice between those two, do nothing rather than do harm. So the goal of the free software movement is that all programs be free so that all their users can be free. But why define free software this way? Why are these four freedoms essential? Each freedom has a reason. Freedom 2, the freedom to help others, the freedom to redistribute exact copies of the program to others when you wish, is essential on fundamental moral grounds so you can lead an ethical, upright life as a good member of your community. If you use a program without freedom 2, you are in danger of falling into a moral dilemma. At any moment, whenever your good friend says, "That program is nice, could I have a copy?" In that moment, you will face a choice between two evils. One evil is to give your friend a copy. And I think the microphone is dying. It always happens. Let's see if anything can be done. It works for the moment over here. So, to give your good friend a copy and violate the license of the program. The other evil is to refuse your good friend a copy and comply with the license of the program. If you are in the dilemma, you ought to choose the lesser evil, which is to give your good friend a copy and violate the license of the program. This is not going to last. Let's see if this one works better. Why is this one the lesser evil? Because if you can't avoid doing harm to one or another, it's less bad to do harm to somebody that deserves it because he's done wrong. Now, we can assume that your good friend is a good member of your community and normally deserves your cooperation, because usually that's how it is. But the developer of the proprietary program has deliberately attacked the social solidarity of your community. So if you have to do wrong to your good friend or the developer, do it to the developer. However, being the lesser evil doesn't mean it's good. It's never good to make an agreement and break it. Not even in a case like this one where the agreement is evil and keeping it is worse than breaking it. Still, breaking it is not good. And if you give your good friend a copy, what will she have? She will have an unauthorized copy of a proprietary program, and that's a nasty thing. Almost as nasty as an authorized copy of the same program. So, when you have fully understood the issue, what should you really do? You should make sure you don't fall into the dilemma. I know two ways. One is, don't have any friends. That's the future that the proprietary developers have in mind for you. Instead of friends, maybe you could have Facebook friends. The other way, my way, is don't have the program. If you don't have the program, you can't fall into the dilemma. If anyone asks you for a copy, you say, sorry, I don't have one. You don't have to do any wrong. So if somebody offers me a copy of a program without freedom to, in other words, on the condition not to share it with you, no matter how attractive it might be, I say, my conscience does not permit me to accept those conditions, so take your nasty program out of here. I will not betray the social solidarity of my community by promising not to share with others. And you should reject those programs also. Reject programs that deny freedom to. And reject also the propaganda terms that they use to demonize cooperation and sharing. Terms like pirate. When they call sharing piracy, what are they really saying? They're saying that helping others is the moral equivalent of attacking ships. Morally speaking, that's as wrong as you can get. Because attacking ships is very bad, but sharing is good. So let's not call them both by the same name. So when people ask me what I think of piracy, I say attacking ships is very bad. If they ask me what should we do about piracy, I say send the Navy. If they ask you about piracy in Poland, say, don't worry, there's no piracy on the Baltic and hasn't been for centuries. If they ask me what I think about movie piracy, I say, I like the first Pirates of the Caribbean. You get the point. I look for funny, pointed ways to reject their propaganda term. Because that's the whole point. You see, if you repeat the enemy's propaganda terms, you're spreading propaganda for the enemy. Anytime they lead you into using the word, quote, piracy, unquote, to refer to sharing, they have recruited you, perhaps unwittingly, as their propagandist. So that's the reason for freedom to, the freedom to help others, to redistribute exact copies when you wish. Essential on basic moral grounds. Freedom zero, the freedom to run the program as you wish, is essential for a different reason, so you can have control of your own computing. And every user deserves to have control of his own computing. But there are proprietary programs whose licenses restrict even the use of the authorized copies. For instance, there was, and maybe still is, a proprietary program for managing websites whose license forbids using it to publish anything that criticizes the program's developer, which was Microsoft. So in this case, a proprietary program literally denies users the freedom of speech. Well, obviously, if you can't even freely use the copy that's there for you to use, you don't control your computing. So freedom zero is essential, but it's not enough. Because that's the freedom to either do or not do whatever the code of the program is set up to do, which means the developer continues imposing his decisions on you, not through the license if you have freedom zero, but still through the code itself. So, to have control of your computing, you need freedom one, the freedom to study that source code and then change it so the program does your computing the way you wish. That way you decide instead of the developer. Now, I should point out one little but important point about freedom one is, part of freedom one is that you can actually use your modified version. There are products that we call tyrant devices that don't allow users to put in a modified version of the software and have it run. And in this case, even though you, in many cases, do have the source code of that program, and then you can change it and you can compile it, you can make a modified version, but you can't get it to run in that device, because that device will only run the versions that come from the developer. It won't run your versions. Well, that's not having the freedom to control what the program does for you. So that's not freedom one. That's why we say the freedom to study the source code and change it so that the program does your computing the way you wish. That means you can actually run your modified version. Without that, freedom one is just theoretical and doesn't exist in practice. Now, if you don't have freedom one, you can't even tell what that program does when you don't have the source code. So, frequently, it's designed to do something nasty. It has intentional functionalities that are nasty. Now, in life, there are many rare dangers. Tonight, while going home, you might get killed by a falling asteroid. Well, it's not likely to happen. You might get robbed. Well, that's still pretty unlikely. It happens, but probably won't happen to you today. I'm not talking about one of those rare dangers. Being the victim of malicious functionalities is the usual case for users of proprietary software. Let me prove it with a list of examples. There are basically three kinds of malicious functionalities. There are surveillance functionalities that spy on the user and transmit data about the way the computer is being used. There are functionalities to restrict the user. These are known as DRM, Digital Restrictions Management, or digital handcuffs. And there are backdoors, which receive commands from somebody else to do something to the user without asking permission and without warning the user normally, without informing the user about what's being done to her. And one proprietary package that has all three of them that you may have heard of is called Microsoft Windows. Now, I'm talking about specific known surveillance functionalities, visible user restriction functionalities, because if the machine refuses to do something, that at least the user can tell. And specific backdoors. Now, the backdoors can't be seen normally. It's not obvious that there is a backdoor, but we know of two of them. So, Windows is malware. Malware means a program designed to hurt the user. Well, Windows is malware. But it's worse than that. You see, one of the backdoors is universal. That means that Microsoft has the power to remotely impose software changes. It can make any change at all in Windows remotely without asking permission. This means that any malicious functionality that is not in Windows today could be remotely installed tomorrow. So Windows is universal malware. Windows is not alone in being malware. Mac OS is malware too because it has digital handcuffs. But the software in the iThings is nastier. People have found several surveillance features. They pioneered the nastiest digital handcuffs, tightest digital handcuffs ever in general purpose computing when Apple imposed its control over the installation of applications. Before that, any general purpose computer allowed users to install the programs of their choice. They could just install whatever they wanted to, but not the iThings. Apple imposed censorship of application programs and carries out this censorship in accord with its business interests. And when the users find ways, against Apple's best efforts to stop them, to break these particular handcuffs. They call it jailbreaking, which recognizes that these computers were designed to be jails for their users. There's also an acknowledged backdoor. So, the software in Apple's computer products is malware. Then there is Flash Player, which is malware. It has a surveillance feature and digital handcuffs. Flash Player is gratis, but it's not free software. And this demonstrates that being gratis doesn't make a program okay. What difference does it make that Flash Player is gratis? It means that Adobe does not require users to pay to be abused. Angry Birds is malware. It has a surveillance feature. It collects location information to send to somebody. The PlayStation 3 software is malware. In fact, game consoles restricted the installation of applications before general-purpose computers did. And somebody found a way to jailbreak the device, and Sony sent the police after him, which is why we say boycott Sony. Look at boycottsony.org. Then there's the Amazon swindle, a so-called e-reader, which swindles readers out of the traditional freedoms that readers have enjoyed for centuries. For instance, there's the freedom to acquire a book anonymously by paying cash and not be listed in any database. This is impossible with Amazon because Amazon won't accept cash. Amazon makes users identify themselves. So Amazon maintains a giant database listing all the books each user has read. The existence of such a database threatens human rights. It cannot be tolerated anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter who has the database. It's intolerable in any case. Then there's the freedom to give the book to somebody else after you read it, or to lend it to various people, or to sell it to a used bookstore. Amazon abolishes these freedoms with digital handcuffs in the swindle, together with end-user license agreements that deny readers these freedoms. And through those end-user license agreements, Amazon says that people can't own books anymore. Amazon says, all your books belong to us. That's what Amazon thinks of private property rights. Then there's the freedom to keep a book as long as you wish. Amazon abolishes that freedom with a backdoor in the swindle. We know about this backdoor by observation. In 2009, Amazon remotely deleted thousands of copies of a particular book. These copies were authorized copies. They had been obtained from Amazon in the approved fashion. They were authorized copies until the day Amazon erased them. Once somebody came to my talk and said that he was one of those people, the book disappeared as he was reading it. This was an Orwellian act. And you know what book it was? It was 1984 by George Orwell. Well, there was a lot of criticism of Amazon, so Amazon promised it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. Which, if you've read 1984, is not very comforting, because that book presented a totalitarian state whose crimes began with destroying any book it didn't like. The official name of that product is the Kindle. Kindle means to start a fire. I suppose that's meant to suggest that the real purpose of the product is to remotely burn our books. But it's never going to get mine because I'm never going to use it. And I hope you'll never use it either. For a list of the injustices of the swindle and other similar devices, look at stallman.org/ebooks.pdf. So, my last example of proprietary malware is the software in nearly all portable phones, which has a surveillance feature. It will send out the GPS location information on remote command, and the users can't stop it, and a universal backdoor that can be used to forcibly impose software changes. And that has been used to remotely convert portable phones into listening devices. You've heard of software that has a bug. This software is a bug. And it transmits all the sound in the room. You don't have to speak into the microphone for it to listen to you. It can listen to you from over there. And it listens all the time. It transmits whenever it hears anything. The only way to stop it is to take the batteries out. Oh, but now there are some phones where you can't take the batteries out. I wonder why. So that's why we have the stickers that say iBad. Well, these examples, these programs are used by nearly every user of proprietary software. So I've proved that almost all users of proprietary software are the victims of proprietary malware. However, these are just a few programs. There are thousands of proprietary programs. Are they malicious? Are they malware or not? We can't easily tell. We can't look at their source code to find out. We don't know if they have malicious functionalities, and the people who are stopping us from finding out are the owners, the same ones who might have put in the malicious functionalities or might not. So effectively they're saying, just trust us because we won't let you check what we did to you. And they're saying, we're a big corporation. No big corporation would ever mistreat people. So programs without freedom one are just trust us software. And of course you can't trust them. Plenty of times they prove that you can't assume they're trustworthy. But I'm sure some of those programs were honestly made with no malicious functionalities. We can't tell which ones they are, but I'm sure there are some. What can we say about them? Their developers are human, so they make mistakes. The code of those programs has bugs. And the user of a program without freedom one is just as helpless facing an accidental error as facing an intentional malicious functionality. If you use a program without freedom one, you're a prisoner of the code. Now, we developers of free software are human too. We also make mistakes. The code of our free programs has bugs also, because every non-trivial program has bugs. You can't avoid it. But if you find a bug in our free code, or anything in the code you don't like, you're free to change it, because we did not make you our prisoner. We can't be perfect. We can respect your freedom. So freedom one is essential. But it's not enough, because that's the freedom for one user to study and change the source code and use the modified version. Well, With freedoms 0 and 1, the users get individual control over the program. But individual control is not enough because most users don't know how to program. They don't know how to exercise control directly, individually. But even if the user is a programmer, it's still not enough because basically everybody's busy. Every programmer knows a few programs and is working on them. But nowadays you're likely to use thousands of programs, and no user, no matter how brilliant, could possibly study and master the source code of all the programs she uses, nor personally implement all the changes she might want. That's more work than one human being can do. So the only way we can fully have control of the programs we use is by doing it together, working together, collaborating. Thus we need collective control of our programs also. And for that we need freedom 3, the freedom to contribute to your community, the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions when you wish. With freedom 3, various users can work together changing a program to do what they wish. And when they're happy with it, they can release it to the public too. And that way everybody gets to use that version. Even the people that don't know how to program get to use that improved version if they wish, if they think it's better. Could someone bring me another bottle of water? I'm strangely thirsty. It's rather hot in here. I'm afraid there are too many people in this room. I guess the room wasn't actually designed to have so many people in it. They must have figured that most of the seats would always be empty. Is there any window that could be opened? I don't normally like windows, but I'll make an exception. Is there an air conditioning system that can be turned on? Does anybody know? Is there anybody whose responsibility is to contact the people in charge of the building? Is there somebody in charge here? Who's in charge of this event? I didn't plan this event.
Unfortunately, Dr. Stallman, the air conditioning is turned off. It's winter.
No.
Bureaucratic idiots. I said, it's winter. By definition, no air conditioning is needed, no matter how hot it is. Well, thank you. So, freedom 3 is also essential. Without it, yes, each one of us would be free to implement the same change. But what a waste it would be to write this change millions of times, and the people that don't know how to program, and the organizations that don't have any programmers, they would be left out completely. That's no good. Freedom 3 is essential. And all the users get the benefit of the 4 freedoms. Every user can exercise freedoms 0 and 2 to run the program as you wish and redistribute exact copies, because these don't require programming. Even if you're not a programmer, you still can do these things. Freedoms 1 and 3, the freedom to study and change the source code, and then optionally distribute copies of your modified version, these entail programming. So only the people who know how to program can directly do these things. But when they do, and when they release their modified versions, everybody gets to run them or not, as they wish. And thus we all get the benefit of living in a society where the users have the four freedoms. And the four freedoms together give us democracy. A free program develops democratically under the control of its users. Leaving so soon? I hope it wasn't something I said. So every user is free to participate in society's decision about the future of the program, which is simply the sum total of the decisions that the users make about what to do with it. By contrast, a proprietary program develops under the sole and total power of its owner and functions as a yoke, an instrument to subjugate users for that owner, and the owner can then command them, exploit them, and abuse them. Because ultimately, with a program, there are just two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. When the users control the program, that's free software. You see, the users need the four freedoms to have effective control over the program. The four freedoms give the users both individual control, one by one, and collective control in any groups that they choose to make. But if they don't have the four freedoms, then they don't control the program, so the program controls the users, and the owner controls the program, and through it exercises power over those users. So this is why a non-free program generates a system of unjust power. Thus, society has a choice to make. On one hand, we have individual freedom, social solidarity, and democracy. On the other, we have the sole and total power of the owner. Society must reject proprietary software and choose free software. Thus, we invite you to escape from proprietary software and come live with us in the free world that we have built. Our goal is the liberation of cyberspace. I started the free software movement in 1983. I wanted to make it possible to use computers in freedom. It was impossible at the time, and the reason is the computer won't do much without an operating system installed. And all the operating systems for the modern computers of the day were proprietary already, which meant that if you bought a new computer, in order to make it useful, you had to have an operating system installed, which was always proprietary, and there went your freedom. So how could I change that? I was one man without much fame outside of the users of the editor Emacs, and without much money, and few people agreed with me. So I didn't think we would get very far with an ordinary political movement, marching in the street and sending letters to officials. And I had no experience doing that anyway. I was not a political organizer. I was an operating system developer. But as an operating system developer, that meant there was another way I could try to liberate the use of computers. All I had to do was write an operating system. And then, as the author, I could legally make it free software, and then everybody would be able to use computers in freedom by using my system. In other words, I could rescue people from the injustice of proprietary software by technical work in my own field. I was aware of the injustice of proprietary software, which most people did not recognize as an injustice. I had the ability to try to rescue people from that injustice, and it looked like nobody was going to do this if not me. That meant I had been elected by circumstances to do this work. It was my duty. It's as if you see somebody drowning and you know how to swim and there's no one else around and it's not bush. Then you have a moral duty to save this person. However, well, actually that statement might be too strong. Perhaps we could identify some other people, like Bush's torturers and the people who protect Bush's torturers, such as Obama, about whom I should not affirm a moral duty to save them. Fortunately, I don't need to resolve all these questions because I don't know how to swim. However, in the real case in my life, the work to be done was not swimming, it was writing lots of code, and I knew how to do that. So I decided to develop a free software operating system, meaning an operating system that would be 100% free software. Every line, every piece would be free software, meaning that none of it would deny your freedom. Every piece would respect your freedom. Then I decided to recruit other people to help develop it so as to get it done sooner. There was no need for it to all be written by me, it just needed to all be freedom respecting. Then I decided to make it a Unix-like operating system, so it would have the same technical merits as the Unix operating system, and so that the people who knew how to use Unix would be able to, because there were lots of people who used Unix back then, so that they would all be able to use my system right away because you'd use it the same way. And then I gave it a name which is a joke. No matter how serious the project is, it still needs a name which is a joke. That's part of the hacker spirit. Ha ha, are we serious? And there was a tradition in my community that when you developed a program that was similar to or inspired by some existing program, one way to give credit was to give your program a name that's a recursive acronym saying yours is not the other one. So after I wrote the first Emacs editor, there were about 30 imitations, and one was called Fine for Fine is not Emacs. And there was Sign for Sign is not Emacs, and Eine for Eine is not Emacs, and Mince for Mince is not complete Emacs. And version 2 of Eine was called Zwei, for Zwei was Eine initially. So I looked for a recursive acronym, and what I came up with was GNU, for GNU's not Unix. So when people ask, what's GNU? You could respond, GNU's not Unix. And this is a lot of fun because it sounds like you're telling them what it's not, but in fact you're telling them exactly what it is. However, in order to be a joke, it has to have two meanings. So it's a good thing that that GNU is a word. It has another meaning. It's the name of this animal that lives in Africa. But it's even better than that. The word GNU is the most humor-charged word in the English language, used in countless word plays, because according to the dictionary, the G is silent and it's pronounced GNU. So every time you want to write the word GNU, instead of spelling it N-E-W, you can spell it G-N-U, and you've got a joke. Perhaps not a good joke, but there are lots of them. So we have been conditioned to associate this word with laughter. You see the word GNU and you're almost ready to laugh already. However, when it's the name of our operating system, please do not follow the dictionary. Please pronounce it GNU. Because if you say the new operating system, you're already wrong. You see, we've been working on it for 29 years, and we've been using it for 21 years, so it's not new anymore. But it still is GNU, and it will always be GNU. So please avoid the pronunciation error that sounds like new. However, there's another pronunciation error that's even more common that you need to avoid, which sounds like Linux. Strange to say, most people, when they talk about the GNU operating system, they pronounce it Linux. What a bizarre error. It started with a confusion around 1992. You see, at that point, we had almost all the pieces needed for the system, but one major essential component was still missing. That's called the kernel. The kernel in an operating system is the program that allocates the computer's resources to all the other programs you run. Well, we started developing the kernel in 1990, but I chose an advanced, elegant architecture which turned it into somewhat of a research project, and it took many years to get it to run at all, and it still doesn't work all that well. You could run it if you want to. But it isn't really ready for prime time, which is sort of a shame, it's sad. But fortunately, we didn't have to wait for it, because in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had a proprietary kernel called Linux, liberated it. He released it under a free software license, specifically the GNU General Public License, which is the license I have written to release the components we developed for the GNU system. But I wrote the license so that other people could easily use it to release their programs, and that's what Torvalds did. Now, I should clarify, the GNU GPL is not the only free software license. There are dozens of free software licenses, but most free programs use the GNU GPL. In any case, once Linux became free software, the combination of Linux and all the other big and small pieces that made up the GNU system were a complete free operating system. For the first time, you could buy a PC and run it with free software. So the liberation of Linux was a major contribution to the free software community. But it also led to a confusion, because remember, we thought that our kernel would be working any month now. So we were focusing on that, but other people put Linux together with the almost complete GNU system, and they made something which was basically GNU with Linux added. But those people were focused so much on the kernel Linux that they perceived the whole GNU system as a small add-on, and they started referring to this combination as a Linux system, which means giving the main developer of the system none of the credit, which is not very nice. So please, when you talk about the system, call it GNU/Linux or GNU plus Linux. Please give us equal mention. Since we started the whole thing, since we contributed more of the code than any other project, I think it's fair to ask for equal mention. Now, there's more at stake here than credit. After all, credit's not the most important ethical issue in life. And if it were just about that, it wouldn't really be that important. What's really important here is that freedom is frequently threatened. To keep it, you have to defend it. And many people don't appreciate it enough to defend it, so they lose it. Well, this is true in all areas of life, and we've known it for a long time. But in other areas of life, the debate about human rights has gone on for decades or centuries, and people have spread ideas of human rights around the world. Which provides a base to try to defend human rights, and sometimes we succeed. However, computing is a new area of life. It's less than 20 years, even in the most advanced countries, that most people use computers. And in most of the world, it's even less. Well, that's not a long time to have a debate about what human rights you deserve in using a program. But in fact, for most of society, there never was such a debate. Nearly everybody started with proprietary software, surrounded by other users of proprietary software, and they didn't know any other possible alternative. So they took for granted that proprietary software was morally legitimate. Which means, in effect, they let the owners, developers of proprietary software dictate the answer to the question, what human rights do you deserve in using a program? And they dictated none at all. They dictated that they can impose any conditions they like, and the users can take it or leave it. So we in the free software movement are trying to start this debate. We claim we've identified 4 human rights that a person deserves in using a program. They're the 4 freedoms that define free software. They should never be taken away from anyone. But when we try to bring this idea to the attention of even the users of the GNU system, we run into 2 obstacles. First of all, they don't know it's the GNU system. They think it's Linux. They think of themselves as Linux users, and so they ignore us. You see, the people who think that the GNU system is Linux tend to admire Mr. Torvalds tremendously. They believe that he developed the whole system. It all started from him, that it came from his vision of life. And what is his vision of life? Well, he doesn't believe that you deserve to have control of your computing. He doesn't believe he deserves to have control of his computing. He just doesn't think of this as a matter of ethical principle. He says he's happy to use proprietary software if it's powerful and reliable, meaning he'll give up his own freedom. He's entitled to his views. I respect that. However, he's not entitled to cite our work as a platform for spreading his views in opposition to our views, which are the reason we did the work. But that's what happens. You see, the people who think the system is Linux and they admire Mr. Torvalds tend to follow his political views also. And that means that they don't learn to value their own freedom, and they won't join us in fighting for freedom either, which means they're likely to lose it, and we might lose it with them. If there are not enough of us to win, we could all lose. So we write articles to explain these ideas, but when these people who use the GNU system and call it Linux see our articles, what do they think? They say to themselves, this article comes from those GNU extremists. Why should I read what they think? I'm a Linux user. I admire the pragmatic philosophy of Mr. Torvalds. I should point out that pragmatic in issues of politics tends to mean choosing important long-term issues based on short-term convenience, which I think is not wise at all. But in any case, there's a specific disagreement here. And these people reject the views of the GNU project because they admire GNU so much, except that they think it's Linux. Now, this is ironic. If they knew that the system really is GNU plus Linux, then they'd say something different to themselves. They'd see the article and they'd say, oh, this is an article from the GNU project, and I'm using the GNU plus Linux system. I had better pay attention to what they say because the system that I love comes from there. And then we would have a chance to convince them that they deserve freedom and they should fight for it. And then maybe they would help us and we would win. So you see, all of our freedom is at stake in whether people fight for freedom. And if you help inform people that the system is GNU plus Linux, it will help us convince them to join in the fight for our freedom. But there's a second obstacle. Nowadays, in English especially, most discussion of our software doesn't use the term free software. It uses another term, quote, open source, unquote, a term I reject. And I reject it because its purpose was to reject the free software movement. You see, in the 1990s, there were as GNU/Linux gained popularity, there were two political camps in the free software community. There was the free software movement, which said the things that I've explained to you, and then there was the other camp, the people like Torvalds, who didn't consider this an ethical issue. They didn't believe that there were some freedoms that they should have, but they liked the free software, so they used it and helped develop it for their own reasons. So they were in the free software community, but they didn't agree with us. Well, there was a debate between these two camps, so people coming into the community could see the debate, and they would see that the free software movement existed, and then they might agree with us. So, to some extent, still, our software carried with it our views. But in 1998, the people in the other camp coined the term open source, which had never been used in computing before. And since it was a new term, they had the chance to decide which ideas to associate with it. They left out the entire ethical foundation of the issue of free software. They chose to present this purely as a practical issue with nothing at stake that's deeper than practical convenience. So, instead of saying you deserve to have control of your computing and of the software you do it with, they said, it's convenient to be able to get bugs fixed. Instead of saying, if you release a program, it is morally incumbent on you to respect the freedom of the users by making it free software, they would say, if you develop a program, it's in your practical commercial interest to let the users change it and redistribute it, because then they'll make the code better quality. So where we appeal to the values of freedom and community, they appeal to the value of code quality. A fundamental philosophical difference. Well, they were the majority of the community in 1998, and most of the businesses in the community were in their camp. So their discourse dominated. Most of the journalists and the politicians followed them, and ever since then we have had to work hard just to inform people that use or talk about our software that the free software movement exists. Because all they tend to hear is open source, and they assume that we agree with the open source people. So an article might mention me, but it sounds like I'm an open source supporter. And this has misinformed most of our community. I get messages several times a week from people who say that they appreciate my contributions to open source. And I have to write back and say, I certainly never intended to contribute anything to open source. I disagree with it. I see articles that call me the father of open source. So I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. And then I explain the ideas of the free software movement, which is the point of the letter, to show the readers of that periodical the free software movement ideas that were missing from the article that they read. Of course, I started with a joke just because I like jokes, but also I think maybe if I started with in such an outrageous way, maybe that'll get to print the letter. So I do everything I can to correct this misinformation, but I can't do enough by myself. We need you. So, I mean, people who have open source views, they have a right to state their views, but they shouldn't give the impression that that's where this system comes from. And they shouldn't give the impression that I agree with them, but that's what they do. So you can help in this giant competition for mind share between free and freedom and open. Well, you have something to contribute. It's up to you what you say. But if you want to support our campaign for freedom, you can talk about freedom. You can say free only software. And then you will be standing up for the idea that this is an issue of freedom and not mere transparency. And by the way, it turns out that almost everyone misunderstands what open source is supposed to mean. With free software, we have an English word that has two meanings. So there are two possible interpretations. We have to tell people it's free speech, not free beer. Well, the problem with open source is it has only one natural meaning, and it's the wrong one. It doesn't mean what they say it means. You'll find almost when they coined the term, they gave it a definition, and the definition is pretty close to the definition of free software. In practice, there are not very many programs that are open source but not free. The only reason they didn't draw the line at the same place we do is that it's two different people interpreting the definition. So, of course, it's not going to come out at the same place. But they intended it to be the same category of software. But most people misunderstand, and they think that open source just means you can look at the source code, which is not the official definition at all. It's a much broader definition. And so it ends up causing, the term open source ends up causing harm twice. First, because it covers up the ethical ideas, and second, because everybody misunderstands the practical criteria. So, join with me and insist on talking about free software, especially when you're talking with other people who are saying open source. That shouldn't be the time you give in, that should be the time that you stand firmest. Because that's exactly where we need your help. Because the fool and his freedom are soon parted. If we just give people freedom and we don't teach them to appreciate freedom, they will lose it. Life gives people lots of opportunities to lose their freedom. If they don't care and they're not looking, they won't hold on to it. And they'll be gone before they realize, or they'll sell it, they'll trade it for something else that seems fun. If they don't realize how important it is, they won't hold on to it. In fact, we've lost our freedom in the free software community multiple times for failing to care enough. I'll give you a couple of examples. In 1992, Torvalds liberated Linux, and people combined it with the GNU system and made GNU plus Linux. So we had a free operating system, and you could buy a PC and run it in freedom. But it wasn't easy. At the beginning, you had to tinker with it, you had to become an expert to get it to work. So people started trying to make it easier. They developed distributions of GNU/Linux designed for easy installation. A few years later, there were several distributions competing in a community where most people didn't value freedom. So the developers of some distribution had the idea that they could gain popularity over the other competing distros by adding some non-free programs and presenting those to the users as advantages of that distro. They did it, and it worked, because most of the users didn't demand freedom. They didn't think in terms of freedom, so they perceived the non-free programs as advantages instead of as attacks on their freedom. So that distro gained popularity, and the developers of other distros said, they're gaining. We had better put in non-free programs to do the same job so that they won't have an advantage over us anymore. So over the next few years, they all did that. So 15 years ago, when people asked me, where can I get this system? I had to say, I'm sorry to say it, but although there are dozens of distros, there is not one I can recommend because they all contain non-free software. In other words, we had reached freedom and we had fallen back and lost it, because most of us didn't care enough to hold on to it. Well, I'm happy to say that today there are completely free GNU/Linux distros. For instance, Ubuntu and GLAG, which stands for GLAG, Linux, and GNU. And there is GNUsense, which is another kind of joke. You see, it's written as GNUsense, but it sounds just like my job title as the head of the GNU project. I am the chief GNUsense. And there's also Triskel and Dragora and Parabola. You can find the whole list in gnu.org/distros. But as I'm sure you can tell if you work with the system, these are not the well-known popular distros. Those continue to contain, to install, or to lead people towards non-free software, which means they are not entirely ethical. So we have begun to recover the freedom that we foolishly lost, but just begun. We have a long way to go. And what's the problem with the non-free distros? Well, first of all, if you say to somebody you should switch to GNU/Linux, chances are he will pick one of the non-free distros because those are the well-known ones, which means he won't go all the way to freedom. But worse, those non-free distros and what their developers say have a lot of influence on the community. People come into the community and what do they see? They see people talking about the non-free distros, and what do they say? They don't talk about freedom. They talk about open source. You see, it would be uncomfortable to talk to people about freedom if you're not providing and respecting freedom. So all the people involved with promoting the non-free distros avoid the issue of freedom generally. They don't want to explain why their distros are flawed. So they don't talk about that. They don't say demand freedom. They say we provide the best possible user experience. So when you're trying to reach a distant goal that's going to take decades, the central job is not to forget the goal. But those distros are encouraging our community to forget the goal or never even find out about it. And that's the big problem. But then we lost our freedom in another way. Nowadays, the source code of Linux, the kernel, is not entirely free software, and it's not entirely source code. In some source files, you'll find a long table of numbers, which is really an executable program dressed up as source code. But that's not really source code. You don't get source code from an executable by representing it as a long string of numbers. That isn't the real source code. The real source code for those programs is not available, so they're not free software. In addition, many of them carry explicit non-free licenses, which means they're not free software. Well, what's going on here? Those programs are actually firmware programs. They don't run on the CPU. They are there to be installed into various peripherals to make those peripherals run. And that's why I guess Torvalds decided it was okay to include them, although I don't see why that should make it okay. It's still non-free software that's installed in your system. But in any case, for him, this was never a matter of principle in the first place. He initially released Linux as proprietary software in 1991. Then in 92, he made it free, and then some years later, he started putting in non-free pieces. Well, I know why he wanted those non-free pieces. There's some peripherals that won't work without them. So it's a fact. We can't use those peripherals in the free world. They don't work. There are two possible reactions to that fundamental problem. One is to acknowledge it and say, here's a free system. It can't run those peripherals because we don't know how. That's what we do. The other way is Torvalds' way, which is to make it appear that those peripherals work by putting in non-free programs, and the result is you're not in the free world anymore, but he doesn't tell you that. So, to make a kernel that we can ethically use, we have a set of scripts that we use to maintain a totally free variant of Linux, which we call Linux Libre. So what happens is every time Torvalds releases a new version of vanilla Linux, we run the deblobber script, and it makes the new version of Linux Libre. So it's not a lot of work. It was work to make the deblobber scripts, but we have them now. So now this is not much work, and we can offer a kernel that's ethical, because it's free software. It doesn't handle those peripherals. So really what we want is to make those peripherals work in the free world. But that's not easy. That's not as easy as deleting a piece of non-free software. That requires real work. It requires reverse engineering. Somebody has to figure out the specs to run that hardware so that someone else can write the free software to run it. If you want to make a technical contribution to the free software world, and you want it to be the biggest possible contribution, you want to make an important contribution, do this reverse engineering. This is what we need most. This is where we need your technical help. But if you want to make the biggest contribution possible, and it doesn't have to be technical, then do it by spreading the philosophy of free software and by organizing the fight, because that is more scarce than programming. I told you 2 examples of how we lost our freedom. There are more, but this is enough. Our future depends above all on what we value. If we value freedom and we're willing to make a sacrifice for it, then we can keep our freedom. But if we won't resist when it's taken away, if we'll sell our freedom for some sort of convenience, then it will be gone. And nowadays, you can end up running non-free software on your computer without even knowing it's in there, just by browsing the web, because many web pages contain proprietary code written in JavaScript that gets installed silently into your browser and then run in your computer. A year ago, the only way to stop this was to deactivate JavaScript all the time, which is what I did and still do, in fact. But now we have another more convenient and selective method. It's a Firefox add-on called LibreJS. What this program does is it analyzes all the JavaScript code that tries to run in your browser to see if it's either trivial or carries a free license. And in those cases, the code is allowed to run. But if it's not trivial and not free software, then it's blocked. And the program warns you there is non-free, non-trivial JavaScript code in this page. It has been blocked. But it does more than that. It heuristically searches the site looking for how to send a complaint and where. And then it says, would you like to complain? And this way you can easily and quickly complain because you don't have to look for how. It's very important to send these complaints, because how are we going to make the webmasters make their sites work without non-free JavaScript code? We're going to have lots of people saying, I don't like this. I may not use your site at all. I didn't use your site at all. Start respecting our freedom. So we need your help in that way. However, nowadays there's another way to lose control of your computing. In the past, the way you would lose control of your computing was to run a non-free program. so that you couldn't control what it does. Well, that still takes away your control of your computing, but now there's another way you could lose it, and that is software substitute as a service, or a SaaS. What that means is, instead of doing your computing in your own computer by running some program on the data, you would send all the relevant data to somebody else's server, where your computing would get done by the programs he installed in that server, which you can't see or touch. And so he decides completely how your computing gets done. And then it sends you the results, or it takes action directly on your behalf, dealing with other people. And this way, your computing gets done, but you don't control it. So it's the equivalent of running a non-free program in terms of the harmful result. But there's a different mechanism producing the result. With non-free software, you have a copy of the program, but you can't control what it does. With software substitute as a service, you don't even have a copy of the program that's doing your computing. He's got a copy. He installed it in his server. Now, it might be free software or it might not. If it is free software, then he controls that copy, but you don't, so it doesn't do you any good. If it's not free software, then he doesn't even control what it's doing on his computer. He's lost control to somebody else, but that somebody else is not you, so this doesn't help you any. It doesn't give you back the control you ought to have of your computer. It just means that control of your computing is sort of divided between him and the software developer or owner. But neither of them deserves to control your computing. So you simply need to reject SaaS. But in fact, SaaS is even worse than running a non-free program. I've explained how some non-free programs have spyware, that they send data about the use of the computer to some server. Well, to use SaaS, the user has to send all the relevant data to the server. The result's the same. The server has the user's data, and who knows what's going to show that data to. But it's even worse. I explained how some proprietary programs, including Microsoft Windows and Google Chrome, which is a proprietary browser, and most portable phones, have universal backdoors. That is, a backdoor that allows remote installation of software changes, which means that somebody can change how the user's computing gets done without even asking the user for permission to change it. Well, with software substitute as a service, the computing is done by programs chosen by the server operator. And at any time, that operator could install some additional programs or replacement programs and change how the user's computing gets done without asking the user's permission. So SaaS is inherently equivalent to a proprietary program with spyware features and a universal backdoor. Now, I said we don't know who they're going to show that data to, what they're going to do with it. Well, in some cases we know. If it's a U.S. company, it's going to show that data to the FBI without even a court order. Because the law, the U.S. has an oppressive law that requires this. But more generally, the U.S. doesn't have European data protection law. So you can't trust your data to a U.S. company. And I've seen lawyers arguing that foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies are subject to the same law. So if it's a European company, but it's owned by a U.S. company, it's going to have to show all the data to the FBI without a court order. But in practice, websites nowadays give away data about their visitors before the site operator even gets it. Because web pages will often have, for instance, something that gives information to some other company. If you see a like button in a web page, then Facebook knows that your computer visited that page. Because the image of the like button comes from a Facebook server. So Facebook server has to send that image to your machine, and the browser tells it why it asks for that image. It says it's for the following page. So Facebook knows that your machine visited a certain page. That's surveillance of you, even if you are not a Facebook user, even if you never were a Facebook user. If you're the main user of that computer, Facebook knows you visited that page. And it does so getting the information directly from you. It's not that the company that runs that web page tells Facebook. It's rather it sets up the web page so that your browser tells Facebook. Well, this sneaks around European data protection law. So there is a proposal right now to reform European data protection law. But companies like Facebook and Google and so on are lobbying to basically defeat the purpose of this change and ruin data protection law. So you need to get active now. You need to fight right now. You need to organize and talk to your members of the European Parliament and say, no, we don't want to leave any room for companies to innovate in how they're going to spy on us and pass around our personal data. Your job is to stop them from innovating like that. So, there are a lot of threats to our freedom. Yes?
Access pointy jakieś, nie wiesz?
Pleased to meet you.
Te na dole, nie? No, skóry tam.
Well, I would have been.
Bez anteny, nie? Nie wiem, czy widzisz na ten... Teraz na 4. piętrze na techu jest ten... Taki kombo z 3 antenami. Bo tam teraz... No, chyba tak. Zrobili tam ACI.
Another threat that we face now is patents on computing ideas. A large program implements thousands of different ideas together. If 10% of those ideas are patented, that's hundreds of patents, each of which would enable somebody to sue the developers and the users of the program also. So patents on computing ideas are tremendously dangerous. And most of Europe has just done something utterly stupid. I'm talking about the unitary patent. Basically, the idea was to sort of combine all the patents